encounter with the Samaritan woman is seen in verses 19 to 24. After Jesus had come and asked her to give him a drink, after she said, how's it you're talking to me, a woman and a Samaritan at that, and Jesus said if you knew who it was who's asking you, you'd ask him and he'd give you water that you'd never have to draw water from this well again. So we're going to talk about that at the end instead of the beginning. But then she begins to say, Sir, I perceive you're a prophet. This is the verse, 19. The woman said to him, Sir, I perceive that you're a prophet. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and you people say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know. For salvation is from the Jews. But an hour is coming, and now is, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. Now, do you get the idea that Jesus is talking about worship? 10 times in those 5 verses, Jesus said and used the word worship. You get the idea that he's talking about worship. Now, we like to talk about worship in our modern world, in our modern day. We like to talk about worship as things we do, as actions we accomplish. Singing is worship. Praying is worship. And I'm here to tell you that it may not be. It might not be worship. It might be vain worship. You might be singing the right words and thinking the wrong thoughts. It might not be worship. So one of these days we're going to study again the idea of worship as it is taught by God in the Bible. Because our idea of worship and God's idea of worship is not always the same. I got to tell you my story again. I had a friend when I was preaching in Long Beach, Mississippi, way back before the flood. We became pretty good friends, studied guys and everything, and later on his wife got killed in a big accident, a terrible truck accident, and it just devastated. And he just went off the deep end. He went emotionally unstable. And it took a long time for him to get back. And finally, evidently he did. He started to get back, So I got an email one day. It was years, several years, He said, is this the Gerald Bennett that I knew over here on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi? And I wrote him back and said, it's me. And so he wrote me an email, and not just me, but several people saying, he was teaching and preaching again, some in a little church. And so he was going to preach on this context, these verses. The verse that says, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. And so he said, I'd like for y'all to give me some feedback, And I sent him a little email back, and I said, well, I'll tell you what I think, but you don't want to hear it. I said, most of the time when we read this verse, we think about God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him with the right attitude and according to the word. And that's about as foreign from this context as anything anybody ever said about the Bible. God always demanded that people worship him with the right attitude, even under the law. Even under the law, he wanted them to have the right attitude. That's why Jesus condemned all those Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes for their hypocritical worship. And he always wanted them to worship him according to his word. God prescribes how he wants us to respond to him, not us. And it is amazing, So we're not talking about people who think they could worship him some other way. We're talking about people who think they're worshiping him according to the word, but they missed the boat. True not the word. Truth here is the real thing. The true thing. And it's in contrast with the law covenant and the grace covenant. And that's throughout the Gospel of John. Now, I'm going to suggest that to you, and we'll talk about it. So, three things we see about worship in this text, okay? I'm going to come back and make the point, I hope. So y'all hang with me. Thanks. We see the people of worship. Remember, the Samaritans were claiming to worship God in Mount Gerizim, where they're in their territory. And the Jews were saying, no, Jerusalem is the place you have to worship. So the Samaritans had a temple in Gerizim, on Mount Gerizim. The Jews had a temple on Mount Zion, or on the hill there of Jerusalem. And so Jesus, when he talks about this worship, he says, let me first lay the foundation of this idea of worship. I was going to do that anyway. The word worship is used in these 6 verses 10 times. The word, that didn't come out real good. The word is, from the Greek, is proskuneo. The word means to kiss the Lord, to do obeisance to bow down before. And a while ago when we were singing that song, Holy, 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 I started to get down on my knees just for effect, but I was afraid I'd mess y'all up. And then I was afraid I couldn't get back up. So I didn't do that, But you remember, when a person came before a king or a dignitary, how they would get down and they would do their obeisance, And of course, a lot of people do that hypocritically too, don't they? Yeah. But if it's the king, guess what you better do? If you don't want to lose your head, you better give him the reverence that's his. Now, folks, how much more? See, do you remember I told you about Bush and then about Jesus? Listen, if we pay Bush that kind of respect, folks, how much respect should we be paying Jesus? How much reverence? And it's not that you physically get down and do the things you do. Oh man, we've talked about positions of prayer. We've divided sometimes even over, what kind of position did you have in prayer, The Pharisees stood, and it isn't amazing, by the way, in our modern world, we say, okay, we all stand and pray. But it's not the physical position that matters. It's the position of the heart and of the mind. Kind of like that little boy I keep telling you about, his mother's punishing him in the corner, and he says, I may be sitting here in my body, but in my mind I'm outside playing. Well, the response to that is, I may be standing here while you lead me in prayer, but in my mind and my heart, I am bowing myself before God. Now, do you know that takes an effort? That takes some thought. That takes some desire and some purpose. That's my word, purpose. So, in this verse, Jesus says, the true worshiper shall worship him in spirit and in truth. The real worshipers will worship him in spirit and in truth. Now, again, let me make the emphasis. It's not on the people themselves. It's on what the people themselves are actually doing. True worshipers, that is, those who are worshiping really, in reality. Now, folks, what we're doing right now, me preaching and you listening and sometimes responding, that's only worship when? When we're actually bowing before God and giving him, the glory and the obeisance, the reverence that's his. In our thought processes and how we think and deal with what he's saying. How do we respond? True worshipers. And the second thing he says is, it is worship of the Father. Now that's an interesting statement to me, by the way, in this conversation. See, the Samaritans called him Father, and the Jews called him Father. Now, they called him Father, and in this process, by the way, remember the patriarchal system. God is the patriarch. God is our Father. And you're supposed to honor your father and mother. Reverence them. Now maybe we need to preach a sermon on that one of these days, and not just for the children coming in on this, but for some of us that are in our second childhood. It's worship of the Father. It's worship of Jehovah God. Now, so the Samaritans were saying, we're worshiping the Father, and you know what Jesus is saying? No, you're not. Now think about that. Because he responds with them, and I think I have my verse here. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. Now you people are saying you know God, but you don't know God. You people are saying you're worshiping the Father. You're not worshiping the Father, because you can't worship the Father that way. You're saying, no, we know the law says Jerusalem, but the Jews won't let us go there, so we're going to substitute Mount Gerizim. We're going to have another place, another way. You worship what you do not know. And I'm going to emphasize that. Listen, this is worship of the Father, and it's got to be who the Father is. Sometimes, by the way, how many of y'all think y'all know President Bush? Without him, maybe I'll say, how many of y'all thought you knew Obama? No, but we've learned a lot about Obama. And by the way, that's generally true with all of our politicians. I'm not feeling Republican or Democrat. I'm just saying we got the best politicians money can buy. I'm not trying to exalt anybody or lower anybody. I'm just telling you, politicians are politicians. That was true in Jesus' day, and it's true in our day. Now, so he goes on to say, let's notice then, not only the people of worship, they've got to be true worshipers, and they've got to be people who worship the Father, but the place of worship. And the place of worship with the Jews, Jesus said, believe me, woman, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. Now, I want to set the context. Does that mean that they could never worship the Father on Mount Gerizim? No, they couldn't. Does that mean that they couldn't worship the Father in Jerusalem? No, they could. So what's he talking about? Worship is not limited to a place, to Samaria. Worship will not be limited to a temple on Mount Gerizim in Samaria, even for you Samaritans. And you Samaritans are worshiping wrong. But you should worship if you worship in spirit and truth, and we'll come back to that. Not limited to Jerusalem. You see, under the Old Testament, folks, the temple was in Jerusalem. And you had to go to Jerusalem.